Hi everyone, I'm back here with another 100% history book. I know I recently reviewed The Lemon Tree, or fairly recently, but that one was more of a journalist's style of history, focusing on the story of the meeting of two particular families as it related to the broader relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But this one is a history book through and through, sometimes painfully so, at least in my opinion. Mao's Great Famine by Frank Dikötter. So I've read basically nothing about Chinese history in any time period before. What little background I did have going into this book was what I've learned about communism in general as it took shape in the Soviet Union during the 20th century, which I've discussed in some of my other history book reviews on this channel, like those of Iron Curtain, Red Famine, the Bridge at Andau, and the Court of the Red Tsar. Wow, I'm actually getting to the point where there are too many to list them all, so that's a bit of an achievement. But anyway, I knew very little about Chinese history at any point in time, other than that there's this highly controversial figure called Mao Zedong, who in some form or another led the rise of communism in China. I realize my Chinese pronunciation is not going to be accurate. I'd like to learn more about how to pronounce these names correctly, but for now I'm just going to do my best to pronounce Chairman Mao's and other names as similarly as I know. Again, though, I do want to work on that. I have to admit I didn't even know Chairman Mao's precise role in the civil war that preceded the establishment of a one-party communist government in China, and after reading this book, that still wasn't fully clear to me, since it's not really in the domain of this book. Okay, so what is this book that I keep referring to? I mean, what is it exploring specifically? Well, it's one of three books by Dutch-born historian Frank Dikötter that are now collectively referred to as the People's Trilogy. In fact, somewhat confusingly, it could either be called the first book or the second book in the trilogy. The first because it was the first one published in the year 2011, or the second because it's the second one in chronological order. The book called The Tragedy of Liberation comes before it and covers the years 1945 to 1957, and that's probably the one I should read if I do want to learn more about the Civil War and the role that Chairman Mao and others played within it. Mao's Great Famine, the topic of this review, which won a major British nonfiction award called the Samuel Johnson Prize in the year it was published, then covers the years 1958 to 1962 in the period that was called the Great Leap Forward, a massive endeavor for agricultural and industrial economic development that resembled some of the earlier five-year plans of the Soviet Union, but which also, like some of those pushes in the Soviet Union, led to serious hardships, including widespread famine and starvation for many of the Chinese people. Finally, the last book in the trilogy, both by publication and by chronological order, covers the Cultural Revolution of 1962 to 1976 and is called, well, the Cultural Revolution. Before I talk about the contents of the book, I just want to emphasize what a massive undertaking this was by Frank Dikötter to collect and assemble the information that went into not only Mao's Great Famine, but the other two books as well. A lot of the stories in this book are basically never before been seen accounts, at least not in a book context, because he worked with a lot of people who were living through this period, who interviewed their relatives and companions for this book, and he also had access to some archival information that until recently would have been impossible for anyone but the upper echelon of China's Communist Party to access. And even now, access to these archives is incomplete, as well as remaining hard for someone without proper historian credentials to examine. So the very fact that Dikötter has done this research and compiled it in any form whatsoever is worthy of praise. What I'm going to focus on a bit more for the remainder of this video, though, is first of all, how does it read as a book? And second of all, how is the analysis? Is Dikötter in the book proposing shocking or provocative new interpretations of history, or do these facts fit more within a broader narrative that largely remains unchanged and mostly the same, even if we now do have more details to prove that it happened, or to understand what it meant for people in China on a personal level? While reading this book, it was hard not to compare it to Anne Applebaum's book, Red Famine, which was actually the very first history book I reviewed on this channel a little over half a year ago, and talked about the Ukrainian famine or Holodomor. As you might expect, there's great similarity in the events of the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933 and the Chinese famine of 1958 to 1962. These books both outline the ways in which each country's communist government directly contributed or even caused these famines, at least in the author's opinions, but also in my own conception after reading these books. Both expose the atrocities and the humiliations and the general degeneration of society that occurred as people became basically unable to do anything other than worry about whether they would find another meal before they died. And harrowing tales are recounted in both books, often in gory detail. Which I'm not criticizing, by the way. It certainly makes these books harder to read, and at times they can feel so awful that my mind almost turns off to it altogether because it just can't or doesn't want to relate to these stories, but it's incredibly important, nevertheless, that these stories be told. Still, the biggest problem I had with Red Famine was that the level of detail Applebaum went into, particularly in the middle section describing the events of the famine itself, was often just too much for me. Not only because it's disturbing, but also because it felt like she was giving a level of detail that was suitable for historians, but a bit much for the general audience. But Red Famine still was worth reading for me, in large part due to the unifying beginning section and end section, which really explore the causes of the famine, social, economic, and political, and its broader impacts that in some cases reverberated for many years beyond the famine's end. Now, unfortunately, I had the same criticism of Mao's Great Famine as I did of Red Famine, but Mao's famine piled on even a greater level of details and didn't even give quite enough of that broader context to make it a super worthwhile read for me. I'll admit, perhaps having already read Red Famine before Mao's Great Famine, I was a bit jaded isn't really the right word, weary, cynical. What I mean to say is that the events presented in Mao's Great Famine are horrifying and really just tragic, but for me they unfortunately weren't surprising or shocking anymore in the same way as they were when I read Red Famine. And I do think that some of this is because my mind saw so many parallels to the story of Ukraine 25 years earlier, thinking throughout this book, yes, that's what happened in Ukraine as well. I mean, if anything, it was just maddening how eerily similar the two accounts were, just further getting across that classic point that we should study history because it often repeats itself. Of course, this did leave me wondering, in what ways did the famines in Ukraine and China differ? The exact political situations in each of the two countries prior to their periods of famine is maybe a little outside the scope of these books, but the ways in which political pressures then directly contributed to the famines is certainly an important consideration. I mean, one bit I gathered myself is that while in the Soviet Union, some have argued that Stalin was pretty aware of the damage his grain requisitioning policies were doing to the people of Ukraine, but just didn't care much because he saw the victims as political opponents, whether Ukrainian nationalists or kulaks, that is, capitalist-leaning and more wealthy peasants. On the other hand, you could make the case that Mao fundamentally saw the peasantry of China as mostly on his side, but also maybe wasn't even fully aware of the extent of the famine because everyone reporting to him felt the need to dress up and majorly exaggerate the numbers to avoid displeasing him. And these speculations could certainly be debated, but that's not done in this book. They're not given a whole lot more thought, which I found disappointing. So yes, despite telling an important historical story, there is little overall story to be found amidst the piles and piles of statistics about piles and piles of grain in all the different provinces. Aside from the political causes of the Great Leap Forward, if you're trying to learn more about this event, you'll really have to do quite a bit of outside research to piece it all together. In most chapters, I could pretty much distill the main message down to a few sentences, or at least a few paragraphs, and everything else was just details about how, for example, the figures from every grain product in every season in every province really do support the claim that there was reduced productivity during this period, as well as mass suffering. And of course, a lot of these observations, though important and factually consistent with everything else we're seeing here, are not particularly surprising. They don't alter our view of the situation or contradict what might have been our first impressions. We learned that corruption was widespread and affected a lot of different spheres, that women, children, and elderly people were treated about as badly as we might have guessed they were, along with many other things that I guess are important for someone to confirm, but that we probably would have assumed if not told otherwise. Even the personal stories that, in theory, might add a little bit of personality or human empathy to the story generally failed to do that for me. These little anecdotes, even when they described completely wretched experiences, always felt too short and disconnected and impersonal. They never were quite on the level where they enabled me to relate to the victims on a human level, rather than see them presented as facts to show us the consequences of the famine and of Mao's policy. My impression was also that this book adds detail to the historical record without really adding a new interpretation of the prevailing narrative or offering radically new ways of interpreting the history, which is not a criticism in and of itself, although I wish Dikötter were more clear or at least visibly conscious of where his work fits within the academic landscape. Readers could also be reasonably skeptical of his biases, and although I do think the facts and details he provides are solid in and of themselves, he makes no secret of the fact that he basically considers Maoism a complete disaster, and it's not even clear whether he's considered what challenges an opponent of his viewpoint might pose here. I mean, maybe he has, but it's not evident from this writing or the interviews with him that I saw on YouTube. His work is also more an exploration of the psychology, propaganda, and overall rhetoric of the Great Leap Forward, as opposed to any dissection of the economic underpinnings or the bureaucratic implementation. Dikötter would likely claim that this is because there was no sound economic basis. It was all politically, strategically motivated nonsense. But it would be interesting to read a discussion focusing more on the economic aspects and implementation and breaking down what the core theory behind these practices was and suggesting how this could have been done better, or maybe explaining why it couldn't have been under better leadership. A few other criticisms worth mentioning that I won't delve into too deeply. I don't think there was enough said here to prove that this famine was caused by Mao, despite that I believe that this is largely true due to consulting other sources. And this book also attributes certain intentions to Mao that may well have been the case, or may not have been the case, as pointed out by others, including a fairly lukewarm review by Dmitri on Goodreads that I'll link below because I pretty much found it spot on. You're certainly not going to get the full psychological analysis of Mao from the story, except insofar as his political ambitions to make China the leader of the communist world fomented a rivalry with Stalin, and later even more so with Khrushchev, whom he saw as a revisionist, or basically a soft communist with capitalist tendencies, all building up this pressure that spurred Mao to launch the Great Leap Forward in the first place. The discussion of these political tensions was, by the way, one of the best and most interesting parts of the book for me, and I actually do want to learn more about the Sino-Soviet relations, that is, relations between China and the Soviet Union, now that reading this book piqued my interest. And this is a good stepping point into 20th century Chinese history for me in particular, just because I've read quite a bit now about what was happening in the Soviet Union during this time period, so I do have a bit more historical context than I would for other periods in Chinese history. Will I read Dikötter's other stuff? Yeah, probably. Despite not loving this one, some people like Dmitri said on Goodreads that the other books in the trilogy were more insightful, and really the topics for both of these other books seem like they'd make for more interesting accounts within a more political and global story. In fact, I'm just going to interject here and say that by the time I'm filming this review, I'm actually finished with Dikötter's book, The Cultural Revolution, which, well, it definitely got me interested in the topic, but I still found Dikötter's way of presenting it rather boring and frustrating, leading me to consult a lot of outside resources, some that I found very illuminating and interesting. More on that in the later review, though. I also hope to read some stuff by other authors about China as well, so plenty of room open for learning ahead, as I know there's just tons of good stuff to read out there on this country, not only by Western historians, but also by Chinese people who either have studied the history or are describing their accounts as they experienced it firsthand, for example, in memoirs. So that's it for Mao's Great Famine. Stick around and subscribe for my review of those other books at some point. Probably fairly soon I'll get around to reviewing the Cultural Revolution, since I have found that one at least thought-provoking. And until next time, bye, and happy reading.